Thank you for joining today's U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Missouri River Basin Water Management Call. This call is intended to provide an update on basin conditions for congressional staff, tribal, state, local government officials, including news and media representatives on current conditions, planned operation of the MAINSTEM reservoir system. The National Weather Service will provide a river flood outlook and additional weather forecast information. This call is being recorded and the recording will be placed online. Following this call, your participation acknowledges your consent to be recorded. The recording will be available at www.nwd.usace.army.mil/mrwm/public meetings. All lines have been placed on mute. To unmute your line to ask a question at the end of the call, press *6. Please be aware that the forced mute function does not necessarily work on all phones, so you may need to use your phone's own mute function. However, you may also be double muted if you use the webinar to call in. So you may have to unmute on your computer as well as your phone if you've used both. Today's call, I've already provided that, includes National Weather Service and John Remus and his staff from the Missouri River Water Management Division. And with that, I'm going to hand the call over to Kevin Lau.
All righty. Thank you, Eileen. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, I can.
Okay, perfect. Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the National Weather Service, I wish to thank the Corps of Engineers for inviting our participation in this series of public meetings. Again, my name is Kevin Lau. I'm a hydrologist with the National Weather Service, Missouri Basin River Forecast Center, located near Kansas City. And I'll be presenting, as Eileen said, weather and climate information for the basin. With my first slide, we're going to be taking a look at where we have been. This first slide is a snapshot. Oh, well, I guess this is what I'm going to be talking about. Okay, sorry about that. So with this second slide, I guess, we'll be looking at the temperatures and precipitation that we've experienced across the basin over the past 90 days. Now, this graphic is a bit dated, a couple of weeks old, not quite a couple of weeks old, but in taking a look at the current 3-month look back, these graphics are very similar to what you would see today. So on the left is shown the overall temperature or departure from normal temperature in degrees Fahrenheit over the past 3 months. Oranges and reds on this left-hand graphic would indicate above normal temperature. Greens indicate below normal. And as you can see, and as you have experienced, the Missouri River Basin has been warmer than normal over the past 3 months. The right-hand graphic depicts the precipitation across the basin over the past 3 months in terms of percent of normal precipitation. Again, oranges and reds are areas that have received less than normal precipitation over the past 90 days. Greens and blues are those areas where greater than normal precipitation has fallen. And as you probably have guessed, most of the Missouri River Basin has received less, in fact, far less, in most places, less than normal precipitation. So that's over the past 3 months. With my next 2 slides, we'll venture into the future to see what the folks at NOAA's Climate Prediction Center believe is coming our way with regard to temperature and precipitation. So this first slide here, we're looking at the long-range temperature and precipitation outlooks for the next 3 months. So this is for November, December, and January. The left-hand graphic shows or says that climatologists expect temperatures to be higher than normal across the southern portion of the Missouri River Basin during the next 3 months. Again, November through January. That's shown in the brown. So that's across the southern portion of our basin. However, it's anybody's guess as to what temperatures will do across the northern portion of the basin. The white area in this left-hand graphic means that there is an equal chance, a 33% chance that we'll have near normal temperatures, a 33% chance we'll have warmer than normal, and a 33% chance that we'll have cooler than normal. So the white area, there's not enough signal to tell us. So there's an equal chance for the next 3 months as far as temperatures go. The right-hand graphic depicts the precipitation trends that we should see over the next 3 months. For all but the Northern Rockies, which is shown in green, for all but the Northern Rockies, the Missouri Basin again is in this white area where we have a 33% chance of above normal precip, a 33% chance of normal, and a 33% chance of less than normal with regard to the precipitation. So the Northern Rockies do show up in green, and so that means that chances favor a wetter than normal December through November, December, January for the Northern Rockies. So that's a positive. Okay, for the next slide, I'm going to look even further out into the future. We're looking at February, March, and April of next year. February, March, and April of next year. Again, on the left-hand side, we've got temperature, and we see that chances favor a colder than normal northern portion of our basin, and that is in line with the La Nina climate situation that we expect to happen. So chances do favor a colder than normal northern portion of our basin. The southern portion, again, is in white, so we don't know what the temperatures, we don't have a strong signal for what the temperatures will do in that white-hand portion of that left-hand graphic. On the right-hand side, this is precipitation on the right-hand side. Again, we see that for February through April, the Northern Rockies are expected to be wet, and that's in keeping with La Nina. The remainder of the basin that's shown in white is up for grabs as far as precipitation. You do see a tongue of dryness up through Kansas and Nebraska. So chances do favor drier than normal once again for Nebraska and Kansas. Okay, for the next slide, with my fourth slide, we're going to discuss the ongoing drought. Again, this graphic was updated just this morning. But basically what you see is here is what you would see if you went to the graphic this morning. You see that on the left-hand graphic, approximately 75% of the Missouri Basin continues to be categorized as drought. The right-hand graphic shows what the drought conditions are predicted to be out through the end of January. The chocolate brown color are those areas that are currently in drought and are expected to remain in drought through January. The yellow areas are those areas that are not in drought now. So it's like the yellow splotch there in Kansas and the yellow splotch there in northern Missouri. Those are not in drought today, but they are expected to go into drought over the next 3 months. So the bottom line here is that the drought persists and, in fact, in some areas expands. And so that's, of course, not good, but that's where folks are thinking. Okay, with my next slide, I just want to let you all know that on Thursday, October the 20th, so a couple of weeks ago, the NOAA, National Weather Service, did issue its winter outlook. And so you can either go to that very long link, or you can simply Google U.S. Winter Outlook, U.S. Winter Outlook, and you can read what NOAA is thinking for not just our basin, but the entire United States for this winter. La Nina, again, is expected to remain with us. This will be the third winter in a row that we will have La Nina. And typically, but not always, but typically La Nina means below normal temperatures across the northern tier of states and increased chances for an above normal snowpack in the Rockies. So that's what it means for our basin. But no guarantees. That's just typically what La Nina is. And so with my last slide here, I'll summarize. As you all well know, it's been hot and it's been dry. The soil has room to soak up. Let's see. Next slide, please, Eileen. Okay, great. Thanks. So the soil has a lot of room to soak up any precipitation or snowmelt that we'll be getting. As we turn our calendars into 2023, we may develop a good snowpack in the Rockies. That would be good. Montana and the Dakotas are likely to be cold next winter and spring. But for the rest of the basin, no clear signal with regard to either temperature or precipitation for the start of 2023. At the bottom of this slide is shown a link for the monthly climate call that NOAA does for the north central portion of the U.S., which includes our basin, and that occurs during the third week of every month. And I think the next one is for December 15th. So you can register to view that monthly call there from that link. And with that, that concludes my National Weather Service remarks for the call. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. And I will hand it to John Remus.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Good morning. My name is John Remus. I'm Chief of the Missouri River Basin Water Management Division, and our office is responsible for regulation of the Missouri River MAINSTEM dams and reservoir system. This just a little note that this is kind of a makeup meeting. We did complete 6 in-person public meetings last week, starting in Fort Peck, Montana, and ending in Smithville, Missouri. We were scheduled to have one in St. Louis last Thursday, a week ago today, but there was a scheduling snafu, and that's kind of on us. So this is a makeup meeting for that. We posted our draft 2022-2023 annual operating plan on our website in September, and we are accepting comments on that through November 23rd. Meeting format is I will have some opening remarks here, and then I'll turn it over to my senior staff here, Ryan Larson and Mike Swinson, for some technical information. And after that, we will entertain questions. We will go congressional representatives first, and then we'll get to the states, and then eventually to the general public on that. That concludes my opening comments. I will turn it over to Ryan Larson for his technical work or technical presentation.
Thanks, John. Next slide, Irene. So just to reintroduce myself, I'm Ryan Larson. I'm the Reservoir Regulation Team Lead. I'm going to be going over a little bit of the system overview and the upper basin runoff. So first off, our mission when we regulate is to regulate the Missouri River MAINSTEM reservoirs, and when we do that, our priority is always life and safety. The operational decisions that we use when we regulate those reservoirs are driven by annual runoff conditions, and those can change on a monthly or even daily basis. The master manual, which outlines our operational criteria and decisions, is designed significantly around flood control, navigation, and water supply purposes. However, we do have 8 total authorized purposes, the other 5 being hydropower, fish and wildlife, irrigation, recreation, and water quality. As a note, the Corps will always comply with all federal laws, including ESA. However, the Corps will not store more water in the system for threatened and endangered species. Next slide. So this graphic depicts the MAINSTEM system storage zones and allocations, which is kind of an allocation of, or a conglomerate of, if we were to group all 6 MAINSTEM reservoirs into one large reservoir and show their different zones. On a typical year, we'd like to start at the base of the annual flood control zone and multiple use or annual flood control multiple use zone. We would capture the runoff from plain snowpack and mountain snowpack through the spring and summer months. On really high runoff years, we may enter into that exclusive flood control zone, and as the name implies, when we enter that zone, we're operating strictly for flood control. Throughout the remainder of the summer and fall and winter months, we like to meter that water out, supporting all 8 authorized purposes, ending the year right back at the base of that annual flood control multiple use zone. During dry years and long-term droughts, we'll start tapping into that carryover multiple use zone, still meeting all 8 authorized purposes. However, we will start implementing some drought conservation measures at that time, which include lower reservoir releases and lower navigation flow support and minimum releases from Gavins Point during the wintertime. As of October 21st, our system storage was at 47.6 million acre feet. Since we've kind of moved into the next month, as an update on November 1st, we've actually lost an additional 0.5 million acre feet, and we are sitting at 47.1. Next slide. This graphic shows the runoff components for the upper basin runoff above Sioux City, Iowa. And typically those have 3 components: the plain snowpack, which we start seeing coming off in March and April, the mountain snowpack, which enter the reservoir system May, June, July, and then rainfall is kind of the wild card. That can fall any month of the year. Our 2022 calendar year forecast was 19.5 million acre feet in October. That has since been updated to 19.4 million acre feet for the November 1st runoff forecast. And putting that in perspective, our average annual runoff is 25.7 million acre feet. Next slide. This graphic shows the annual runoff above Sioux City, Iowa for the entire period of record that we have, dating back to 1898. The long-term droughts are highlighted in that brown color. There are 4 periods of long-term droughts that we have in the Missouri River Basin. Our 2022 calendar year forecast, as I mentioned, is 19.4 million acre feet now, and that's sitting right around that lower quartile line, which means that there are about 25% of the years in that period of record that are below that number and 75% above. Later on in the presentation, you're going to hear Mike Swenson talking about upper and lower deciles, which would be the upper and lower dashed black lines on that plot. The lower decile just means that there's about 10% of those years below that number and 90% above. The upper decile is the reverse of that. You have about 90% of those years are below that runoff forecast and 10% are above. Next slide. So fall and winter release schedules here. Gavins Point Dam releases will be reduced to the winter release rate starting around November 19th. As always, we will monitor the channel ice conditions between reservoirs and downstream of Gavins Point, making any temporary increases as needed. The Gavins Point winter release, based on our September 1st system storage check, will be the minimum release rate of 12,000 CFS. And the table below highlights some of the other monthly average releases that we're expected to see over the remainder of the fall and winter months. The thing to note for Fort Peck and Garrison is we tend to be a little bit lower in the fall, and then we will ratchet up releases during the winter time to benefit hydropower. At Garrison specifically, we'll increase to around 16,000 CFS at the beginning of December in preparation for the river to freeze in. Once that river freezes in, we can increase releases as that channel becomes a little bit more efficient. As an update from our updated studies, we increased the winter releases for those 2 projects of just a little bit. For Fort Peck, we're sitting around 6,500 CFS, and Garrison will be around 23,500 CFS releases during January and February. Gavins Point is roughly the same as what we had forecasted from the previous month. That 25.9 monthly average release is reflective of our release reduction schedule, which I'll get into more details here on the next slide. But the winter release rate of 12,500 we show that in our study because during cold snaps, we will increase releases out of Gavins Point to help out with stage reductions when tributaries start forming ice and we see drops in stages along the Missouri River. Next slide. This graphic shows our tentative release reduction schedule for Gavins Point. we're going to begin release reductions of 3,000 CFS per day starting on November 19th. We'll do that until we reach 15,000 CFS, and then we'll pause, holding that for 5 days, and then reduce 1,000 CFS per day until we reach our winter release rate of 12,000 CFS sometime in early December. On the right, the table highlights the closing dates for our navigation flow support at various locations along the Missouri River. And with that, I will turn it over to Mike to talk about operations.
Okay, thanks, Ryan. And again, I'm Mike Swenson, the power production team leader in the Water Management Office. I'm going to talk about the results of our regulation this year and our planned operation for the authorized purposes in 2023. First slide here shows the current reservoir levels. Again, this is now somewhat dated, but just generally Fort Peck and Oahe are 14 to 17 feet below the base of their annual flood control zones. Garrison is about 4 feet below the base of its annual flood control zone. Over the next about 3 months here, we'll move some water around in those upper 3 projects so that we have a better balance of water in the carryover multiple use zone prior to the start of next year's runoff season. Fort Randall, as an update, is currently at about 1342.6. That reservoir is typically drawn down in the fall to 1337.5. Should reach that level about the end of November. And then it's refilled over the winter, and that gives us some extra winter hydropower generation. Next slide. Okay, so on Ryan's earlier slide, he talked about the different runoff scenarios. We take those runoff scenarios as input to our models, and then we simulate the regulation of the reservoir system out through next year using those 5 different runoff conditions. This slide shows system storage. The black line is the actual system storage going back to the beginning of 2022. The blue line is the simulated system storage based on the median runoff condition. And we also have the upper and lower decile, which are the 2 dotted red lines. The draft AOP also has the upper and lower quartile information in it. You'll also see on this slide the 3 green triangles. Those are the system storage checks. The first one there is the March 15th storage check, sets the navigation service level for the first part of the navigation season. The July 1st storage check sets the navigation service level for the second half of the season and also the season length. And then the September 1st storage check sets the Gavins Point winter release level. Just going back to look at the black line here again, that's the actual storage. You can see during what would typically be the plain snowmelt period that we really didn't get much increase in system storage during that. We did get some increase in the storage during the mountain snowmelt period. And then now the black line is tracking below that lower decile line right now, and that's a combination of the upstream runoff being really low and also the runoff below the system or the tributaries below the system being low, which is requiring us to release more water to meet the downstream targets. And then you can see next year is very dependent on what kind of runoff we get into the system. Next slide. So these next 3 slides are the upper 3 reservoirs showing similar plots with reservoir elevation rather than storage, and I won't go into as much detail on those here, but they're in the handout there for your reference. Next slide. I will just point out here at Garrison, again, we didn't have much runoff from the plain snowmelt, but during the mountain snowmelt period, we also had a heavy rain on the upper Yellowstone that water was captured in Garrison. So you see we had a steep climb in the Garrison Reservoir elevation during that period. And that's why we still have some water out of balance in the upper 3 projects. And again, we'll start to balance that over the next few months here Next slide. And then this last one here is Oahe. The only thing I'll point out here on Oahe, we'll come back to this on the fish and wildlife slide, but you can see the upper two runoff scenarios. We have mostly rising pools at Oahe next year, but you can see under the lower decile runoff that it is hard to keep the reservoir rising as we get into the late spring and early summer period. Next slide. Okay, so moving on to the authorized purposes. First, flood control. The flood damages prevented in 2021 were $200 million. We're still working on the 2022 numbers, should have those later in the year. You could see on the earlier slide that system storage peaked well below the base of the system's flood control storage this year. Looking out to next year, again, you saw on the earlier slide, all scenarios start next year's runoff season below the base of the annual flood control zone. It's important to note, though, that flooding can still occur during drought periods. That's due to downstream rainfall, and that's particularly true downstream of Gavins Point, where our ability to reduce downstream stages diminishes as you move further downstream due to increased travel times and also the large uncontrolled drainage area below the system of reservoirs. Next slide. This slide shows hydropower generation from the system since 1954. Hydropower is largely influenced by the amount of runoff that we get in the system. You can see during the previous drought from about 2000 to 2007 or 2008, that generation was quite a bit lower, and then during some of the more recent higher runoff years, increased hydropower generation. Now you can see with our last couple of dry years, we're starting to see impacts to hydropower again. Our current forecast for this year is 7.5 billion kilowatt hours. Next year, under the median runoff condition, 8.3 billion kilowatt hours. Both of those are lower than the long-term average of 9.4 billion kilowatt hours. Next slide. Navigation. Again, with the reservoirs being low, we've been in a water conservation mode, so we've had reduced flow support for navigation. We started this year off at minimum service. We made a slight increase after the July 1st storage check, so we were 500 CFS above minimum service. And then we also had a 3-day shortening to navigation flow support. Looking out to next year, again, based on the draft AOP studies, minimum service for lower quartile and lower decile runoff, slightly above minimum service for median runoff condition. And then looking out to the next storage check, which is July 1st, full service or greater, plus a 10-day extension for upper quartile and upper decile runoff. The median runoff condition right now is showing 1,700 CFS below full service. If conditions stay dry, minimum service and shortened season for both the lower quartile and lower decile runoff. The lower quartile is right now showing a 3-day shortening, which would be the same as we had this year, and the lower decile is showing an 11-day shortening. Also, as a water conservation measure next year, we may not meet targets in reaches that do not have any commercial navigation. Next slide. Water supply, water quality, irrigation, and recreation. These 4 project purposes all require access to water. Because of the below average elevations and releases this year, we did have some issues in the upstream areas. For example, the Fort Peck irrigation requested to have a little extra water at the end of the irrigation season. We did have some access issues at some of the rec areas, and the Corps did get some emergency funding this year to try to keep some of those access areas open, particularly at Fort Peck and Oahe. Garrison fared a little bit better because of the higher pool elevation. And then Ryan already talked about the Gavins Point winter releases of 12,000 CFS based on the September 1st storage check. Looking out to next year, again, you saw in the system storage plot that the storage is very dependent on what kind of runoff we get next year. But if we see continued dry conditions, we'll likely have some access issues for the water supply intakes and the recreation areas again, along with irrigation and marinas next year. And looking out to the following winter, Gavins Point winter release of 12,000 CFS under the median runoff condition. Again, the AOP right now is showing a range of 12,000 up to 20,000 depending on runoff next year. Next slide. Fish and wildlife. It's desirable to have steady to rising pool levels at the upper 3 reservoirs during the forage fish spawn. If runoff is not sufficient to do that, we will favor Fort Peck and Oahe next year. And by favor, we mean we would adjust releases at Fort Peck and Garrison to try to keep Fort Peck and Oahe rising during that period. But again, you saw in the earlier slide that in that lower decile simulation that it is hard to keep Oahe rising during that period. We'll continue to do minimize periods of zero release at Fort Randall to the extent possible. This is a challenge sometimes when we're doing flood control operations. In other words, if we have to cut Gavins Point and Fort Randall releases quickly, then sometimes we end up with some hours of zero release. And it's also dependent on the daily average releases out of Fort Randall, depending on what kind of releases we have next year. We'll continue to monitor cold water habitat in the reservoirs. This was an issue during the last drought at Garrison, so we'll keep an eye on that next year if conditions stay dry. Next slide. So then I'll talk about the regulation for the threatened and endangered species. You can actually go to the next one again, Eileen. First, we'll talk about the piping plover. With the reservoirs down and the lower releases this year, we did have a good count of piping plovers this year, highest count in 30 years of monitoring. Overall net success was high because of that. Productivity was down just a little bit this year. The main issue was the rising reservoir level at Garrison during the nesting season right there during June. We saw the reservoir come up quite a bit, and that impacted the productivity there. Then looking out to next year, it's likely we'll have Gavins Point, some sort of steady release flow to target for the plovers. We would set a steady release at the beginning of the nesting season, which was typically about mid-May. We would set that at a level that we can meet the downstream targets for the first part of the nesting season, and if conditions later dry up like they typically do, then we would increase releases or flow to target to make sure we meet the downstream target locations. And then it's possible we do a daily release cycle. That's 1 day up at that steady release level, followed by 1 or 2 days down at some lower level. That can be used as a water conservation measure and also flood risk reduction measure. We'll continue to do intraday peaking patterns or hourly peaking patterns at Garrison and Fort Randall. Those peaking patterns give us consistent stages or peak stages on the sandbars below both of those projects during the nesting season. And so we have less impact on the birds nesting. And then we'll continue to do measures to minimize take as appropriate. Next slide. And then last, talk about the regulation for the pallid sturgeon. At our previous meetings, we've talked about the Fort Peck Dam test releases, the EIS, and the record of decision. I think the important takeaway on this is the last bullet here. Test flows will not be implemented in 2023, mainly due to the current low reservoir level. It's worth noting that we are continuing to work with stakeholders on a monitoring plan and also just working on our processes so when the water does eventually come, that we'll be ready to run those test flows and have a proper monitoring plan in place. Next slide. And so then to summarize, again, this year water conservation measures continue, and they will, through the winter here. All flood storage will be available to start 2023, plus 9 million acre feet of that conservation storage. We'll monitor mountain and plain snowpack this winter, and also monitor the ice conditions on the river reaches between the projects and also below the projects, and make any adjustments as needed. Service level for 2023 navigation likely to be below full service. Based on the November 1st study that we just updated this week, it's looking more and more likely that we'll start next year at a minimum service level. With that, I will turn back to John or Eileen.
I'll take it.
Okay.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Ryan, and thank you, Kevin Lau, for your input here. We'll now open it up to questions. I'm going to let you moderate this. You take it away, Eileen.
Thanks, John. All right, so we will start with congressional members. So if there are congressional representatives who either want to just let us know that you're on the line, or if you have questions, I'll go in alphabetical order by state. Then we will move to tribal, and then the media, and then the public. And so just as a reminder, *6 to come off mute. We do have about 55 callers on the line, so this should go fairly quickly. So if you are a member of the public, don't be discouraged. All right, so I'll go ahead and get started. Again, congressional members, if you just want to let us know you're on the line, or if you have questions, starting with the state of Iowa. Okay, Kansas. Missouri.
Hi, this is
Montana.
Jennifer Hoskins from Congressman Lichtenmeyer's office. I don't have any questions right now.
All right,
Thank you.
thank you. Appreciate you joining us. Montana. I think that was the one I just read. Nebraska. North Dakota.
This is Daryl Nitschke with Congressman Armstrong's office, and I have no questions at this time, but thank you for the information.
Thank you, Daryl. Any others?
This is Rick Collin with Senator Kramer's office in Bismarck. No questions. Appreciate the information.
Thank you. State of South Dakota. And Wyoming. Okay, we'll move to tribal. We'll go through the same process. Are there any tribal representatives on the line that either want to be recognized or have questions? State of Iowa. Again, *6 to unmute your line. Kansas. Missouri. Montana. Nebraska. North Dakota. South Dakota. Wyoming. Then we'll move to the media. Questions from the media, same process, *6 to unmute your line. Please state your name and the organization you represent. Before asking your question, *6 to come off mute. State of Iowa. Kansas. Missouri. Montana, Nebraska, North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming. All right, we'll make this the last round. If you are an agency, partner, stakeholder, or member of the public and have questions, again, star six to unmute your line. State your name and organization before you ask your question. State of Iowa. Kansas. Missouri. Montana. Nebraska. North Dakota. South Dakota. I'm warning you guys, if you don't ask questions, John's going to start telling jokes. Wyoming. Okay, we did have one comment from the chat, and that was from Buzz Madeline, just thanking us for holding this as a virtual meeting and asking us to consider doing it each year. Any other questions from the field or national press, please come off mute to state your name and organization and ask your question. Looks like somebody came off mute.
Yes, I want to ask a question from general public, I guess.
Name and organization, please.
I'm Joe Gibbs. I'm a registered engineer. I've worked for several levee districts here in central Missouri. I was wondering if all of the levees have been repaired yet from the 2019 flood.
Hi, Joe. This is John Remus. We'll have to get back to you on that. We don't have anybody from the districts on board, but I think they're they may not be fully repaired, but they're up to the design elevations. But we'll get back to you on that, Joe.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It looks like the drought and the dry weather is beginning to look like the dry weather we had in the 87, 88, 89, and some in after 2000. But I was looking at that. It seems like we're headed into that again so far. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you, Joe. All right, unless there are any additional comments or questions, I'm going to hand it back over to John.
Thank you, Arlene. And again, thank you everyone for joining us. Just a couple of things. We will start in January. We'll start our monthly calls, which will be very similar to this, beginning in the first part of January. Those will be monthly through at least June next year. We will have in-person, or we're planning to have in-person public meetings again in the spring. That will be in either late March or early April. So look for that in your area as well. Again, I want to thank Kevin Lau and his folks at the Missouri Basin River Forecast Center and NOAA for putting together their part of the presentation and for helping us not just today, but last week as well. And with that, unless there's a question or anything, I think we'll call it a meeting. And thank you.
I didn't see anything in the chat, so I am going to take this recording and it will be available online, hopefully by the end of the day today. So thank you again, everybody, and we will talk to you in January.